And without further ado, I will introduce Catherine Whitney, who is the Director of Curatorial Affairs at HoMA. And I will be driving the presentation today. So give me just a moment, I'll bring that up. And Catherine, feel free to start whenever you like.
Okay, welcome everybody. Let's see, make sure we get the first page going here. I wanted to say hello to everybody, and I assume that pretty soon we might be back in person. I also wanted to say, feel free to get up and get food, get a drink, have some wine, lemonade. And I also wanted to ask everybody if you would all grab a pen and some paper or your phone in your notes section, because we're going to have a little exercise halfway through. So
thank you, dear. Thank you.
And then Jetty, I think
oh, Catherine, I think you just muted yourself. I can't hear.
Okay, sorry about that. If we can jump to the first slide, I think we're sort of halfway through. I see page 14.
Yeah. I may have frozen. Let me see.
I also hope the alarm won't go off. You can probably hear the beeping in the background here. I'm at the office and sometimes the alarm goes off in my office for some reason. So actually, I'm going to try to turn that off just so it doesn't go crazy right in the middle here. Okay, that should be fine. Okay, can everybody see me and hear me and see the slides and everything? Great, great. Well, I wanted to thank you all for coming tonight. I've listened to or joined a number of these Think and a Drinks, and I think they're a really, really fun conversation and opportunity to share interesting artwork and topics. It's also a fun time to have a conversation and get to know you guys a little bit. So I will go ahead and give the presentation, and then we can have the Q&As at the end as we usually do. I am obviously going to be speaking today about Helen Frankenthaler. She was a major artist whose life spanned most of the 20th century, and she was really a pioneer innovator in the second generation of abstract expressionism, which was also called color field painting. She was born in 1928 and she died in 2011, so not too long ago at the age of 83. And in a nutshell, she's really known for her large, colorful, very gestural abstract paintings, and also for a technique that she invented that's called a soak staining method. She developed this really powerful and fabulous, very kind of loose approach after having a very sort of transformative experience in front of a Jackson Pollock painting and then getting to know Jackson Pollock and his wife, Lee Krasner. It's really kind of impossible to start talking about Helen without talking about Jackson Pollock, which we'll get to soon. She and one of her painter friends, Larry Rivers, really sort of swore an oath to Jackson Pollock and to sort of, not to him in particular, but to his approach, and really felt committed to his approach. And that was one of, you might know him as the famous drip action painter of the abstract expressionist movement of the 1950s. And he physically stood over his works of art and his canvases that were on the floor and dripped and splattered and whacked his brush and basically gave this kind of dramatic and powerful choreographed dance over his paintings. Helen was inspired by that, but then she took it one step further and made it her own. And sometimes she doesn't really receive as much credit as she should for this technique. Sometimes it is ascribed to people like Kenneth Nolan and Morris Louis, who were very inspired by her. And that was just kind of an error of some of the art historians because she just didn't get mentioned as much as she did. But I think generally she's generally recognized as the inventor of that. I'm showing you this very iconic image of Helen that appeared in Life magazine in 1957. And it was interestingly taken by Gordon Parks, who was one of the few African-American photographers with the Farm Security Administration in the 1930s and 40s. He worked under Roy Stryker, who worked for the government and worked with a lot of the Farm Security Administration, or FSA, photographers, a branch of the WPA. And they really documented a lot of rural poverty in the United States. And Gordon Parks became very famous for this 1942 image of Ella Watson down in the bottom right-hand corner. And you probably will get the reference to Grant Wood's American Gothic, with the farmer and the pitchfork with his wife or sister or niece, whatever. That's a famous painting in the Art Institute of Chicago. And Gordon Parks was also a Midwesterner and was very into depicting rural labor at this time. So I think it was really interesting and fascinating that an African-American photographer at this time in the 50s was photographing a woman artist for this very, very prominent mainstream magazine. So I just wanted to point that out to you. The title I picked was just kind of a fun, whimsical title. I picked Helen Frankenthaler, The Unbearable Lightness of Being. And that's obviously a reference to Milan Kundera's book, and they made it into a movie, The Unbearable Lightness of Being. And I really wanted to put "un" in parentheses here because Helen had her struggles and she had a hard time, but she also was a very vivacious, funny, vibrant, intelligent woman. And her biographer, Alexander Nemiroff, just came out with this book, Fierce Poise. And he talks about her freedom and bravery to embrace this lightness in painting, which was really kind of antithetical to what Jackson Pollock and the kind of brutal boys of the irascibles of the early abstract expressionist movement were doing. Okay, next slide, please. So my talk tonight is really inspired by this work, which you probably are all quite familiar with, that caught my eye when I arrived here at HoMA. It's one of the works that's highlighted in our exhibition Reflect, highlights of our 20th century collection. It was produced in 1966, and this was 14 years after Helen had her real breakthrough work, which was called Mountains and Sea. That she painted when she was only about 22 or 23 years old. We purchased this painting, and it's called Sun Frame, directly from her gallery the same year she painted it in 1966. And interestingly, we purchased it with some funds from Margaret Emerson, who had sold a Grandma Moses painting. So I thought it was pretty interesting that we had this very kind of traditional other known woman in American art to buy this very fresh new, by 1960, Helen Frankenthaler was really quite fashionable. So, but we did a good thing to buy it. We wouldn't be able to afford this right now. So we were very smart to do that. And I just want to put in a plug for working with and celebrating contemporary artists and getting them sort of on their way up. So it was a very smart move on HoMA's behalf. This also represents her works in the 1960s when she made a move from working with thinned oil paints that she thinned with turpentine to pour them on the canvas, and then started moving into acrylics after 1963. So we'll talk about that more as we go forward. Tonight, I really want to just focus on sort of three main points or chunks of my talk here. The first is to introduce myself to some of those of you who I might not have met or don't know me, sort of where I've been, what I bring to HoMA, why I'm so happy to be here, and how Helen has kind of secretly kind of followed me through my career. And I never really realized that till I started doing this talk, and she has these little appearances throughout my career. I didn't know a lot about her until recently, but this talk was sort of an excuse to do more research on her, which I was excited excited to have that opportunity for. I also want to dive into her story and also the kind of social historical context of the 1950s and the abstract expressionist movement in America. Sort of who was her social circle, what was going on, and what was the context in which she created this sort of thing, and why was it so unusual at that time. And lastly, I want to talk about why her art still matters, and what we've done at HoMA for our recent Joyful Return project, and also the Reflect exhibition, which is part of the Joyful Return, and how we've incorporated this work into the presentation, but also worked with members of our community to help us interpret this. And I see that Grace Simon is here on the call here, and Grace was one of our community members, and she was the one who specifically interpreted this piece very eloquently and very beautifully. So we'll actually play that for you at the end. Okay, next slide, please. I just wanted to tell you a bit about myself. I come from Maine. I'll go into that in a minute, but this is my family here. This picture on the left is from one of the last big travels we had before COVID. My family and I went to Ireland for for my daughter's graduation present, and with some friends. And this is my son Nicholas in the center, who's 15 and headed to Punahou next year, and Bella, who is just finished her sophomore year at USC in Los Angeles. And my husband Mike is here in the picture, and this was a vacation we had in Montana last summer. And this was when I first started interviewing, actually, at HoMA. I was staying at my sister and her husband's cabin in Montana. And we just pulled out of the river. So it's not the most flattering picture of me, but I think it's kind of fun to show what we are as a family. We like to kind of explore nature and do fun recreational things, and we're pretty active. So while not the most glamorous picture, I think it gives you an idea of who we are. Next picture, next slide, please. A little bit about where I come from. I was born about as far away from Hawaii as one can get in the United States, but I love being here. I'm from a coastal community. I appreciate the sea and history, and you guys are all so warm and welcoming, and I'm just delighted and thrilled to be here. But I was born in a little town, coastal town in Maine, just outside of Portland, and we are famous only for two things, the Portland Headlight, and Joan Benoit, who is the first women's marathon gold medalist in the 1982 Olympics. And I saw this picture where she's breaking the Dole pineapple banner from the Dole sponsor. So I thought that was a kind of odd, perfect tie-in. I went to Bowdoin College, a small liberal arts school in Maine, and did studio art and art history there. And then moved to DC and worked for a while in museums, and went to the University of Maryland for graduate work in art history, and studied American paintings in particular. And my program was, I thought one of the great benefits was, although it was pretty theoretical, we had a lot of curators from the National Gallery who are adjunct professors. So that was really an exciting opportunity for me. And one of my thesis advisors is now the deputy director of the National Gallery, and we're still in touch. And so I thought that was a really great kind of early exposure to some museum work as well. So next slide. So as I said, I graduated from Bowdoin College. I moved to DC 5 days later and started at the National Gallery of Art, basically as an administrator or administrative assistant in conservation. So I learned a little bit about painting conservation, paper conservation, worked under the head of conservation, Mr. Merrill, and then within about a year and a half or so, I moved into education, which I thought was what I really wanted to do, and then still love museum education very much. And I worked in teacher and school programs for quite a while, and docents and things, did a lot of teacher summer programs. And then I had an internship in graduate school in the Dutch and Flemish department, which is in curatorial, which is my other love. And then I also had a summer internship at the Hillwood Museum, the Marjorie Merriweather Post collection, which has a lot of Dutch and, French and Russian decorative arts and some wonderful things. Next slide, please. So when I was at the National Gallery, I would take my lunch breaks and roam through the galleries. And I really clearly remember this powerful but quiet kind of explosion on the walls that just really kind of kicked me in the gut. And it was this Helen Frankenthaler work called Mountains and Sea. I was 21, 22, 23 at the time. And I realized while I was doing this talk that that was the same age that Helen was when she created this really watershed work of hers. At the same time, I remember there was a big John Marin exhibition, and John Marin was one of the early American modernists of the Stieglitz circle, Stieglitz being the photographer at the turn of the century, who was the great gallerist and supporter of Georgia O'Keeffe, Marston Hartley, John Marin, and that early modernist school in American art that was really influenced by a lot of European modernists and Cubism. And so I think being from Maine, I was really drawn to Marin's works and these beautiful airy or dramatic seascapes. And I saw a similar sense of that kind of airiness, breeziness, and open celebration of air and sea and nature in Helen Frankenthaler's work. And I don't know why I loved it. I didn't know who she was at the time, but I think I bought a poster and framed it and had it in my first apartment. And I was just, again, just thinking about that when I started researching this and remembering that she'd kind of been there, even though I didn't know anything about her. She's sort of been with me all along. Okay, next slide, please. After that experience at the National Gallery in grad school, I actually became a blue chip art dealer, and I moved to Santa Fe, and I worked as a gallery director and art dealer, mostly in Santa Fe, but did a lot with our New York gallery as well. And I was sort of the gallery's specialist in Georgia O'Keeffe. So Jerry Peters worked with O'Keeffe at the end of her life and kind of made his reputation dealing O'Keeffe's work. So we had a great opportunity to work with the O'Keeffe Museum when they were opening up in the late 90s. And I did some contemporary work when my colleague retired towards the end, but I had a really, a great opportunity to learn everything from pricing to frames to a lot about collectors, and it really opened my eyes in so many ways, and strangely gave me a lot of connections, probably more so than I had gotten from my museum work. So never thought I'd want to be a dealer, but the road just brought me that way. And then after a couple of years of that and living in Santa Fe, I was like, how's that museum career going? And so I kind of readjusted and realized it was time to get back to that. Also, while I was working at the gallery, I came across some Helen Frankenthaler prints, and I didn't know that she was a printmaker. And so we had some wonderful monotypes from the 1980s that she did. And she was also a big woodblock printer, and she did about 30 works in printmaking from about the 1970s to the 90s, and really got into editioned prints. So that was something that I knew nothing about, and had, again, reflected on when I was doing this and thought, oh yeah, I remember being introduced to her printmaking at this time during the gallery work. Next slide, please. In 2010, I moved to Tulsa, Oklahoma to take a job as the chief curator and curator of American art at the Philbrook Museum of Art. And Philbrook has a lot of similarities to HoMA, in that it is in this beautiful historic building that was built in 26 and 27 by a wealthy philanthropist who wanted to bring art and culture to the community and open the first museum in that community. So it's built in this beautiful historic villa. And they also have a expansive collection that's global, transhistorical, cross-cultural, and spans about 5,000 years. It's much smaller than HoMA and definitely not as rich and deep. It doesn't have as much depth and breadth as you guys do. So that was one of the huge draws for me for HoMA. Like, your collection is just top notch and really well known. So putting a shout out there. With the historic structures, we also had a downtown space that we opened while I was there in 2013. And this image on the bottom left is from our downtown space. It's a converted warehouse. And we worked with a lot of contemporary artists as well as historic collections to kind of have contemporary artists interpret historic collections across culture and across time, which is something that I'm very excited about. And I know HoLoNA believes strongly in, and we're all excited about in the contemporary department to do that and to kind of do some more thematic installations across our collections. This is Anila Agha in the top left, and she's a contemporary artist who's Pakistani American. And then below we had a really beautiful installation to open up our downtown space in 2013. Okay, next slide, please. Another thing that we did, I did a large loan exhibition. As I said, I'm an American curator. So I did an exhibition in 2018-19 called Making Modern America. And I really wanted to call it Beauty in the Blight, the Art of American Industry. But my development and advancement director said, I can't raise money for that show in this, oil town, because it was really a town that's built on fossil fuels and extraction. And so we made it a little bit more generic, and we're really wanting to talk about this kind of explosion of modernism in America, but also locally. And so it really examined the paradox of progress through this lens of American art and American industry, and these kind of conflicting and complementary ways that artists worked from about 1910 to 1960 to portray these changes in America, both in the social and the environmental landscape. So that was a way for me to get my sort of environmentalist plug in there. I'm sorry, can we go back? Yeah. Without being too, too dramatic. It really was a balanced show, I think, to show how exciting industry was and how rapid progress was so exciting in America at that time. But, with the rapid technology and progress, you also have consequences in the environment and sometimes in social labor. We also tried to put a lot of exhibitions to kind of reinforce that would have been our sort of gallery 27, 28 space. And so we used our downtown space as well as our foyer to sort of reinforce these kind of environmental themes. So the first one here on the left is a contemporary artist, Sharon Loudon, who's very well known as she's sort of a social practice artist, and she's a real artist advocate. And she worked with these very soft, flexible sheets of aluminum and hung them in our foyer space in this dome. And she transforms spaces and works with light and changing light and air and architectural spaces, and actually reflects the viewer, because she feels the viewer is as much a part of the work of art as the artist and the materials itself. So, it kind of evoked these kind of industrial shiny surfaces, even though it wasn't, technically an industrial work of art or an environmental piece. And then downtown, we had a number of environmentally themed shows. And one was by an artist named Rick Barlow. And his piece was called Sea of Ice Receding. And he had a residency on a ship in the Arctic and took many photographs. And what he does is he uses white chalk in these site-specific installations, and he draws with white chalk on blackboard or on blue board, and does these very highly realistic images that reference climate change and how our Earth is changing. And with this medium of chalk, you can literally just erase it when you're done. So, my Cynthia Lowe would just love this deinstallation. You just wipe it off and it's gone. But with that medium, he's also referencing the vulnerability of not only the medium, but of the Earth, and the effects of global warming and the kind of ephemeral nature of both of them. So that was a really powerful, but very simple, not art doesn't have to be really, really complex and every time you do an installation, but he was a powerful voice. Next slide, please.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Oh, there we go.
Thank you, Jetty. So with this, I just want to kind of give a quick summary slide about what my curatorial philosophy is, and something that we're really working on a lot here in our curatorial department with my great and creative colleagues. And that's that I feel like exhibitions and programs really should allow visitors to travel. They should be fun. They should be, especially now or during COVID when we couldn't, to travel to other times and places, but really to connect to who we are as a community and to the local place and the local time of where we are. They are meant to be fun and to be inspiring and create memories of social interaction. I think our Joyful Return exhibition that we're doing right now, that was one of the key points. You know, let's have fun, let's have it be bright, let's bring people together and have these nice opportunities to share with each other and with the museum and share their voices and memories. And lastly, I feel like I think really good programs and exhibitions are collaborative. They're interactive and they really make the use of our best interdepartmental talents and the infrastructure so that we don't overtax our resources, either, you know, architecturally, staff-wise, financially, and then maybe they can even make money. You know, curators are often the ones that are spending the resources, but sometimes we can generate things. And Joyful Return has really done that. We've used the best talents from across our different departments all over the museum, and everybody on the 7 pop-up installations that we're doing, or 6 outside and 1 in-gallery installations. We've, you know, had members from our installations department, from curatorial, from education, from operations, from visitor services, from the theater, and sometimes taken people like Stephen Salel, who's a Japanese curator, and said, okay, Stephen, you're the lead of the sound experience and sound installation, do it. And so, you know, it's been a little disorienting, but really fun. And we've all kind of worked together and brought our connections and our creative minds and perspectives together, I think, to make a really fun installation here at HoMA. Next slide. Before I left Tulsa, I had another future encounter with Helen Frankenthaler, and that was that a friend of mine who ran an independent bookstore and a organization, nonprofit called his store is called Magic City Books, and he would bring authors into town and have them do book signings and lectures. And he asked if I would interview Mary Gabriel, who just wrote this really impressive biography, I guess you might say, a kind of social history biography on 5 women who really changed modern art in America during the Abstract Expressionist movement. And she calls the book 9th Street Women. And we'll talk about the 9th Street exhibition in just a minute that happened in 1951. And so I had this incredible opportunity to interview this woman. I was terrified because she's also been interviewed in the past by Charlie Rose, and she's a Pulitzer Prize nominated author. And this has become a really important book in modern art and in art of women in the last couple of years. I feel like everybody I hear on podcasts keep referring to this book. And so this was a great experience for me to learn a little bit more about this modern art movement, where my own specialty is about 1890 to 1940 in American art. And this really pushed a little bit beyond what I was more familiar with and studied in school. So I was really excited about this opportunity. And then she actually connected me with a dealer in New York who represents Elaine de Kooning's family. And is kind of a quiet dealer, and well, he's not quiet at all, but he doesn't have a huge storefront gallery. And we were able to purchase an Elaine de Kooning called Michael Sonnabend from 1956 for the gallery, which was a really, really exciting opportunity. I just put this arrow in because there's a little Dotson dog there that you might not even be able to see, but it just shows kind of how out there Elaine was, and her, you know, you always think of the classic art historical setup where the man is painting, the woman is muse, right? So she painted almost all men. And so it's kind of reversing the female gaze, if you will, or the male gaze. So it's now the female gaze. And she painted this man, Michael Sonnabend, who is in her social circle and was actually a Renaissance scholar in New York, who was the second husband of Ileana Castelli, who is married to Leo Castelli, a famous gallerist. And ironically, this all comes together. Leo Castelli was the curator of the 9th Street exhibition, and I'll get into that in just a minute. Okay, next. So I just wanted to say again that I'm super excited to be here. Some of you guys I've met. I look forward to meeting those of you I haven't, but again, it's just been, your staff is incredible. The docents are incredible. Your supporters are great. Your director is fabulous and creative and energetic. And the collection is just any curator's dream. So I love the fact that it's so diverse, and that really reflects the cultural diversity of Hawaii and your complex histories and intermeshed histories here. So I'm feeling very at home and very challenged and very excited to be here. And I just wanted to thank you for this opportunity, and for the opportunity to play with this world-class collection that you guys have, with this very kind of positive, kind of nimble place that HoMA is. And before I jump into Helen in the next slide, once I did get here, we started working on Joyful Return. And I don't know if we've frozen a little bit or if we're able to jump to the next slide. Thank you. Thank you. So if you haven't come yet to Joyful Return, please come, call any of the curators. We can tour you guys through. It is what we call a sort of museum reboot that really is intended to welcome everybody back from the isolation of the pandemic. And it's fun, it's colorful, it displays iconic major masterworks of art, art by local artists from our community, as well as art by the community who is actually producing art or recording art or drawing elements of our flags that we put up. It's in 7 parts, as I said, and 1 part is an in-gallery installation, which is the Reflect exhibition. Okay, next slide. And speaking of Reflect, Modern and Contemporary Highlights, this is an exhibition in 27 and 28. And Katherine Love was the curator of this show, and did a great job selecting these really important pieces in the collection to bring them all together to really celebrate with the community the fact that our collection is so rich and so deep, and not just put major people that everybody knows that are kind of in the traditional art history books like, you know, Andy Warhol or Robert Rauschenberg, but to celebrate some women like Viola Fry. In this piece, the fire suit with large yellow hands. Viola Fry was an artist from California and a real pioneer ceramicist. And, you know, artists of color and women artists represent about, I think, more than half of the entire exhibition here. We've also incorporated many local artists who are prominent, Satoru Abe, Kapolani Landgraf, and realized and put their work up and said, you know, this work really holds next to some of these major iconic artists of the 20th century. So celebrating both on a national, local, and global scale. We also wanted to do more than just sort of talk about these works in our collection from a curatorial perspective. We decided to reach out to our community, and we asked 18 representatives from across Honolulu, across different cultures and backgrounds, different economic situations and professions. And we asked them to pick 1 work from the collection that appealed to them, and to give a reflection, and to give sort of an audio reflection that was 2 to 5 minutes. And then we condensed their statement and put it on a label next to the curatorial labels. But the full, you know, 2 to 5 minute, 6 minute audio cast is on the website, and you can also scan it as a QR code in the exhibition. And wow, were we impressed? I mean, I was saying, why do you need curators? Our community is amazing. And we had teachers of 2nd grade, we had policemen, we had radio jockeys, we had UH professors, entrepreneurs, healthcare workers, and we got an incredible artist in town, and we got an incredible array of voices. So I really encourage you to go onto the website and listen to some of those, or to come into the exhibition and scan them and listen to them, but we'll hear from one later, as I said. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, now's the time to grab your pencil, pen, phone, whatever. And we're going to do a little exercise, a kind of slow looking exercise. And I'm going to set my my stopwatch for, we'll do 75 seconds. Okay. or 90 seconds, whatever. And I want you to look at this. I'm sorry, it's a reproduction and not the actual work, but this is the work that inspired the talk today that's in Reflect, Helen Frankenthaler Sun Frame. And I want you to just spend 75 seconds looking at this before we talk about Helen Frankenthaler, and just kind of, what do you think it is? What does it mean to you? What does it remind you of? There's no right answer, no wrong answer. Everything's valid. How, from the perspective of your daily life or your pandemic affected life of the last year, what does this painting mean to you? And I won't make everybody report out, so don't panic if you don't want to, but we'll take volunteers later. So just take, I'll start the stopwatch and just write down some thoughts. Go. Okay, time's up. Okay, hold your answers and we'll talk about them as soon as we run through her biography, a little bit about her technique and her social circle, and then we'll see what we come up with. Okay, can we advance the next slide, please? You're welcome to add to it, but I'm watching you. So like put your pencils down right after the test. So before we talk about Helen, you really can't, well, the most logical starting point from my perspective is starting with Jackson Pollock. As I said, Helen had a very transformative experience in front of a Jackson Pollock painting at his exhibition, later went to visit him at the Springs in upstate New York with his wife, Lee Krasner. And I just wanted to sketch that in a little bit. So many of you might be familiar with the Abstract Expressionist movement in America. It was basically the first time that New York became the center of the art world, as opposed to Paris or other parts of the world. Abstract Expressionism is often called action painting. It's highly gestural. It's very abstract. It's overall painting. It is not narrative. It is not representative or objective. Objective. It doesn't portray an object on the earth. It's more kind of internally motivated, and it was very large. They took a lot of paint and splattered it. They often did it. Jackson Pollock did his on the floor, and he stood over it and he spattered, and he, it was almost like this kind of, like I said, this kind of dramatic, almost powerful dance and splatter and energetic reigning over these these canvases on the floor. He appeared in Life magazine in 1949 with this spread, and the question, is he the greatest living painter in the United States? And this was 49. And he looks kind of smug, and he's got his cigarette hanging out, and he's very kind of, as a lot of the first generation of abstract expressionists, it was mostly male dominated. It was like Bill de Kooning and Franz Kline and Jackson Pollock and all these very kind of virile, confrontational, I might say, defiant men who were kind of making these changes in the art world right after the war. And a lot of people were angry with the war. They'd lost everything, and they just didn't want to represent what was in the world, because they felt like everything was destroyed, or everything was about hatred and racism and hurt. And so they just wanted to kind of paint from within and create this new thing that recognized the surface of the canvas and the elements of painting and the artist's greatness from within. And then 7 years later, next slide, Helen appeared in Life magazine in a very different portrayal. Jackson Pollock was kind of leaning over it. He was kind of smug. He was in charge. She's kind of set back in her paintings. She's buttoned up. She's kind of demure, she's looking at us with kind of a smirk and pretty confident, but, she's kind of almost within her paintings, almost like a decorative element within her works. And it's a very different portrayal, I think. She's almost sort of floating in her canvas. And her biographer, Alexander Nemiroff, and I have to confess, I have not yet read this because it just was released at the end of March. So it's good timing that we picked this topic. But I've heard a lot of him on podcasts, and he's incredible. But he said that the lightest touch is often the strongest gesture of all. And that's how he describes Helen's work, is this lightness. They were talking about that unbearable lightness of being. Mary Gabriel, who wrote Ninth Street Women, said Helen was painting not on the canvas, but in the canvas. These are two beautiful pieces of hers. The one on the left is Flood, that's in the Whitney Museum. And we'll get into a lot of her saturation and beautiful colors and inspiration in just a minute. But I want to step back and give a little bit about her biography. In the next slide, please. So Helen was born in 1928. It was, in the middle of the roaring 20s. There was a lot going on. The same birth year as Andy Warhol, Shirley Temple, and Walter Mondale. So that's quite a range of personalities and influences, but you kind of get where it is. Mickey Mouse, the Steamboat Willie it was the third edition of that, and it's the first one with sound. And, there was a lot going on. There was Art Deco, sports heroes were big, airplanes and flight was tremendous. Movie stars were big. The Harlem Renaissance was bursting out on the scenes in New York and in Harlem. But there are also a lot of societal and social problems down below, as not kind of unrelated to where we are now. The KKK was big and really ruled the South. Stock market crash was imminent at this time. The Dust Bowl was about to come up, and the dirty 30s were coming in, and pain and loss of livelihood and farms was happening across the Midwest and the Great Plains. And then immigration restrictions were excluding almost all Asians from entering the US at this time. So it was really a very fraught time, even though everybody thinks of it as like everybody was doing the Charleston and everybody had money. It wasn't the case. But amid all this, there was this kind of emphasis with the break with tradition and a celebration of modernity. And Helen was born at this time. Next slide, please. She really had a privileged childhood, but she also had some internal struggles and challenges. This is a picture of her with her family from 1933 from Atlantic City. She's the little one, the little smiling one. She had two older sisters, and she was her daddy's favorite. And her dad was a very well-to-do Supreme Court judge in New York, and or state judge in New York. She grew up upper middle class on the Upper East Side in New York in a Jewish family. And she had access to museums and culture. Her mom was very social, all the progressive schools, and had plenty of money. She was quite a confident child. She remembers pouring nail polish into a sink that she filled up to see the kind of effects of swirl in the water. And I don't know if you all know this story, Harold and the Purple Crayon, when he sort of draws his world, but there's a story of Helen where she took a piece of chalk and drew a line bent over from the back of the Metropolitan Museum to her house on 92nd Street the whole way, and didn't want to get up. And so she was already thinking of line and kind of abstract effects and saturation, even as a little kid at like 5, and doing all this stuff and experimenting. Her dad was just enamored of her, and he said to his wife one time, he said, just watch that little one, she's fantastic. And when she was 11 years old, her dad died suddenly, and the whole family just kind of tanked and fell into this depression, as she did too. And her mother was so busy just trying to get by that she didn't really notice until a couple of years later that Helen was in a state of anxiety and depression. And so she put her in a progressive high school called the Dalton School. Next slide, please. And she attended this school, and one of the art instructors there, and she was just 15 years old, was Rufino Tamayo, who was a pretty well-known Mexican muralist who was teaching art at the school at the time. And they became great friends, and he was sort of her mentor. And he taught her how to stretch canvases and how to mix pigment, and kind of taught her the practical elements of being an artist. And art really kind of helped her through this very, very difficult time in her life. She ended up going to Bennington College in Vermont, which is sort of this very liberal, small college in Vermont. And this is her right around the time of her graduation, I think, from Bennington, with this big smile that she was known for. But her biographer mentions how this smile kind of covers up a lot of the kind of anxiety and issues. She said she, was sort of a self-described hot mess at this time, but still really kind of always getting in trouble and very social and having a lot of fun, but had these underlying issues there. And then the picture on the right is out of Bennington. She also studied under Hans Hofmann for a little bit, and she was producing these very kind of Picasso-esque kind of cubist paintings, just sort of churning those out right after college. And next slide, please. And I just wanted to kind of set the context of this time. 1948, 49, it was, post-war, and there was really kind of this strange year where we're kind of going from the early O'Keeffe, John Marin, Marsden Hartley, early American modernism and Cubist type of approach into right before Abstract Expressionism. And so you've got this kind of almost like objective-based abstraction that's happening. You have John Marin and Picasso and Max Weber, who was a Polish-Russian Jewish-American artist who kind of brought Cubism to America. And she was looking at a lot of these people at that time. And this is a piece she did from about 1950 called Provincetown Bay. And you can kind of see the influence at this time. In 1948, Look magazine surveyed a lot of museum curators and directors and asked them who they thought the #1 painter in America was at the time. And the #1 winner was John Marin, which was kind of interesting, in 1948. And he was doing Oils of the Sea at this time. And Max Weber was #2. So you can kind of see these influences that were kind of just starting to trail off, the kind of grandfathers of modernism, if you will, that sort of influenced her. Next slide, please. In 1950, Helen is living in New York in her apartment. She received on her 21st birthday an inheritance, and so she could be a full-time painter. And that really freed her up to do this. Somebody had asked if she could organize an exhibition of Bennington alums to show, and she invited everybody she knew and everybody in her mom's social circle. She wanted everybody who was anybody in New York to come. And as a 21-year-old, she invited Clement Greenberg, who was this kind of titan of art criticism at the time, to come. And she called him and he said, "Is there going to be alcohol there?" And she said, "Yes." And he said, "Okay, then I'll come." And so he came, and he said, he went through with her, and she was just so brave and daring. This guy he was kind of it. He was a champion of Jackson Pollock. He was a grand formalist, which means he was really promoting works like Pollock that focused on canvas and paint and the flatness of the canvas. And he felt that anything that represented anything in the world really reduced the kind of psychological and emotional impact of a work of art. And somebody in the New York Times actually said that Greenberg was almost like Reggie, the character Reggie in the Archie comic books, that he was really obnoxious, but he was essential to the storyline of this time. So I thought that was kind of a funny time. But they ended up dating and getting very involved, and had a 5-year relationship. And a lot of people say that relationship didn't necessarily help Helen because he never wrote about her work. They had this agreement that he wouldn't review her work. But he really introduced her to the social circles of that time period, including Pollock and the de Koonings, and introduced her to anybody who was important to know at that time. Helen was also one of only 11 women who exhibited in the 9th Street Art Exhibition in 1951. And this was an artist-run exhibition of about 72 different artists who were all experimental and painting very large, Motherwell and Klein and de Kooning and Pollock and Lee Krasner, and they were all there. None of them had money. They took over an abandoned furniture store and exhibited on 2 floors, and nothing sold. But they were all very happy with the exhibition, and this is the exhibition that basically ushered in Abstract Expressionism in 1951. Next slide, please. I just wanted to show you a couple images of sort of her social circle and some of the coupling that happened at this time. So you have Jackson Pollock and his wife Lee Krasner. You have Bill and Elaine de Kooning, who were both very important painters at the time. And I think Bill de Kooning and Pollock sort of overshadowed their wives a little bit, although Krasner, after Pollock died, became very recognized for her work. Some people argue that she was a better painter than he was, but she kind of took literally a back seat to him while he was alive. Helen dated Greenberg for 5 years and learned a lot about herself in the context at the time. And then later in 1958 through 1971, she was married to Robert Motherwell, who is also an abstract painter. Okay, next slide, please. I just wanted to show you some more images. You have Helen in this picture sitting with Pollock and Krasner and Greenberg, and she was like 19, 20 years Greenberg's junior. So she's like this, young 20-something-year-old with these real major figures in New York at the time, and she's just so excited to be there. Also over on the other left side, you have the grand girls of Abstract Expressionism. You have Joan Mitchell on the far left with Helen in the middle, and Grace Hartigan, who is on the right and also down in the color image below. She and Grace were very good friends. I might even say frenemies. They were very competitive with each other, but also good friends, and supported and pushed each other, as a lot of these artists did. I have this quote from her first gallerist, John Bernard Myers, who really was the champion of the second school of abstract expressionists. And he showed, he had performers and dancers and poets in his circle as well as painters. So that whole idea of this kind of creative production is the right and humane solution to our social woes. And I just thought that was really important because, they're coming off their own crisis of the World War II, just as we've been dealing with this pandemic. So just want to give you a little bit more about the social context. Okay, next slide, please. Greenberg really fought the world of Pollock and was really his champion. And he wanted Helen to join him at this very important exhibition in 1950 that Pollock had. And she was very nervous because she knew it meant a lot to Greenberg, and she was young and she didn't know what to expect. She'd heard of Pollock, but didn't know his work very well. And so she went to this exhibition at Betty Parsons Gallery. They rode up the elevator and Greenberg stepped out and he said, "You're on your own, kid." And he basically said, "Go in there, tell me what you think afterwards, socialize on your own." And she was kind of terrified. And she went in there and she was forced to just kind of look at these works by herself. And she describes it as arriving in Lisbon, or, going to a foreign country and not knowing where the heck you were and not being able to speak the language, but really wanting to live there. And she said, "I just wanted to live like Jackson Pollock did and paint like he did and learn that language, but I didn't have the vocabulary yet." And she said he gave her the courage to let it rip. And there's actually a fun podcast that the Getty did about this time period in Helen called Let It Rip. They did a really neat job on that. I also wanted to point out Alfonso Osorio, who is an artist that we have in our collection, who was associated with the Abstract Expressionist school. He was very active in New York. He was born in Manila. And he was influenced by surrealism as well as Pollock and the Abstract Expressionists. This has been up in our Philippines gallery for a very long time. You may not have noticed it. It's now almost a centerpiece in our Reflect exhibition, and it just pops off the wall where it is. I encourage you to see it, but I also put it here because Osorio was very good friends with Pollock and Krasner, and nothing sold from Jackson Pollock's exhibition. And Osorio, who had a cottage house where the Pollocks were staying, felt sorry for him, and he basically bought this painting that's now in the National Gallery of Art. So I just thought that was showing how, you know, these artists were not rich and powerful. They were bold, some of them were young, and they were very innovative, but they supported each other, competed with each other, and pushed each other. Next slide, please. So Helen's big breakthrough was Mountains and Sea, like we've spoken about. And Hilton Kramer basically said, this painting was to color field painting what Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon was to Cubism, which is a pretty bold statement. So Helen's technique, she really was inspired by Pollock, and she just thought, I need to get these canvases off the wall and on the floor. What she did that was different than Pollock is she didn't prime her canvas. So it was unprepared and very absorbent. And rather than kind of splattering and dripping, she said dripping bored her. Anybody could drip, that's an accident. She wanted to be intentional. She thinned her paintings, her pigments with turpentine, and she literally stood over them and poured them and sloshed them around. She said it was a mixture of ambitiousness and laziness that brought her into this style of staining painting. So she basically took what she learned from Pollock and expanded that. And her biographer talks about her freedom to reach this lightness in her work. Next slide, please. I put this up because Alexander Nemiroff, her biographer, also talks about with his students, he uses this analogy of a butterfly, and that Helen really captured this kind of this quickness of life and the living, this kind of first flight and this kind of effervescence, almost transformation from a cocoon into a butterfly that's very, you know, ephemeral, and it's going to be shooting off, and it's beautiful, and it captures light and sun, and it's not capturing, you know, in the 19th century way of or taxonomy that you take a butterfly and you press it into a scrapbook or into a tray, or even Damien Hirst, who captures butterflies and makes these very kind of stained glass, beautiful mandalas, but that it's this kind of this lightness, the quickness, this freedom, and this kind of airiness that she captures that's very magical and very beautiful. Next slide, please. So again, Helen literally stood over these works, sloshed them around. Sometimes you can see her footprints or her handprints in them. And her friend Grace Hartigan, as did many of her friends, thought, what is this? This is like too light, it's too feminine. You know, art is about struggle. This was Grace Hartigan's Massacre from around the same time. And even the women criticized her for being sort of too decorative and too feminine. And Joan Mitchell, who was really kind of cruel to her, accused her of being the Kotex painting, and kind of was referencing menstruation with her kind of staining technique. But it was just different. People weren't ready for it yet. She exhibited this piece in a exhibition for $100, and it didn't sell. And shortly thereafter, when it returned to her studio, Clement Greenberg brought Morris Lewis and another artist, Kenneth Nolan, by her studio to see it. And they were transfixed and were inspired to work in their own staining method. You might recognize this Morris Lewis from our collection here, these beautiful, enormous veil paintings. And sometimes Morris Lewis gets the credit for this kind of staining technique too, but it was actually Helen that inspired him. And he said basically she exhibited, you know, sort of brought from Pollock to what was possible beyond that. Okay, I'll just quickly show you a couple more examples in the next slide of how she just kind of moved forward in the 50s with these very kind of light and airy. I don't know if we're frozen, Jetty, or if that can go into the next slide.
Okay.
That's okay. So these are just some other examples. She used a lot of mythological titles, and and had this very energetic, very kind of gestural energy to her works. She also referenced the history of art and very kind of traditional works from everybody from Manet to Goya to Titian in her works. Although they might be the last thing you would recognize side by side, but she did a lot of touring in Europe and went to museums, and she liked the structure of these works and would even redid a fish painting by Manet to kind of show the light and the energy and kind of the overall structure, if not the really representational or chiaroscuro of some of these artists. The next slide, please. Later in the 50s, we saw the Life magazine spread from 1957. She was really at the top of her game at that time, and she married Robert Motherwell in 1958. Again, Motherwell was sort of, a lot of people said, oh, she was influenced by him, but I would argue that she kind of brought him along. This painting at the top are the two of them, Motherwell on the right and Frankenthaler on the left. And you might recognize this piece by Motherwell that's in the Reflect exhibition in our collection from 1963. And it's influenced by Japanese ink painting, but also is a representation, according to Motherwell, of the surf hitting the windows in their Provincetown, Massachusetts home. So here we have Helen working in their home in Provincetown, all in white, which strikes me as incredibly impractical, but so fashionable to do with these splatter paintings. And then here she is with Motherwell in Provincetown outside of Cape Cod, that had this beautiful sense of light and was also an artist colony. And just to kind of get close to the end here, the next slide. I just wanted to show you, this was an installation shot from a John Bergeron gallery exhibition that shows some of her later works. And as she moved into the 60s, as I said, her work became quite fashionable. She had a one-woman retrospective at the Jewish Museum in 1960. A retrospective at the Whitney in 1968, represented the the Venice Biennale. And in 1989 was only the second woman to have a show at HoMA. So you'll see her works get a little bit more saturated and brighter and more hard edge. She moved from oils into acrylics in 1963. And she worked more with sort of flooding, I would argue, than sort of staining. And the center of her works were sometimes left completely blank, or she tended to kind of work towards the edges and leave the center of things open or dynamic. But you still get the sense of landscape in her work, which she would actually argue against, but it's sort of memories of landscape and working in these kind of sharper, brighter edges and colors, probably influenced by the op art movement, minimalism. And I just wanted to point out, we have another work in our collection. In the next slide, I'll show you. You might know her candle from 1977 that is in Gallery 8. Is that right, Catherine? Gallery 8, I think? Yes. It's a long, thin work. And I think Catherine might be focusing on this later in the year, and we'll probably be able to do some more research on this. But this was gifted to us not too long ago by Barbara Higgins. And it's a strange composition, tall and thin, but in the 70s and continuing on, Helen really worked with a lot of verticals and horizontals in her work. And there's a work in this big catalog called Planet Red from 1977. And Mark Thomas, who's our collections manager, has this theory that I wouldn't disagree with, that this might be almost like a remnant or a element of that painting. I'm not sure, I haven't researched it. I'm just kind of putting it out there for somebody else to research and disprove or prove. But I think it's an interesting concept. And she, had these huge canvases, and she would often just cut off elements of them that she liked better or discard elements. So I'm wondering if this isn't something related to this piece from the same year. But anyways, for a future researcher to explore. Next slide. So here we are, and we've returned to our own work. This is where I want to hear from you guys and also play a reflection from Grace Simon. But our work really, I think, references landscape a bit, but it's very, very abstract. This was a busy time in Helen's life. She was kind of painting and exhibiting maniacally. She was everywhere. She lost one of her best friends in a tragic car accident, David Smith, the year before. And then she had her retrospective coming up a couple years later. I wanted to show you the back of this painting, which I had the opportunity to see when they were installing the exhibition, but you can actually see how it's sort of soaked through the canvas. And I don't think you can see it, but she titled it Sun Frame, 1966 on the back. But Jetty, if you're able to pull up Grace's audio track, and Grace is a mother and a restaurateur, and we'll just hear how she responded to this piece before we share your own reflections here.
Great. Welcome to Community Voices. Grace Simon is a Hawaii-based mother, salesperson, and restaurateur. With a focus on the notion of wishing, Grace interprets the work Sun Frame by Helen Frankenthaler. Having zero art background, my initial perception of this painting can be summed up with the word wishing. I see a woman staring out of her window enveloped in a genie's lamp. Far ahead in the distance, I see another woman staring out of her window, surrounded by her own genie lamp. Between them is a vast, deep blue ocean, which I would describe as the unknown. I imagine that this imagery goes beyond the canvas and is repetitive in nature. Based on the incredible struggles that we went through as a species in the past year due to the pandemic, to me, this piece exemplifies wishing. I can't count how many times I wished for change to happen, for us to get out of mass shutdowns across multiple segments of our economy, for my restaurants to survive, for my children to be able to go back to physical school, for people, including myself, not to lose our livelihoods. I, as many others, was in a constant state of wishing. There was truly a sense of desperation and hopelessness as we experienced the free fall of uncertainty while we navigated through 2020. That's not to say that we're out of the woods yet. However, at least now, there is hope on the horizon beyond the deep blue ocean. Maybe because I'm a woman, I immediately saw two women in the painting. My initial thought was that perhaps the artist, based on the time frame of her career and being in a predominantly male industry, may have tried to use her platform to support women and women's rights. However, after researching her life and career, I found that she had never aligned herself with the feminist movement in art, and was even quoted saying, being a lady painter was never an issue. So while this information did not change my visual interpretation of this piece in terms of wishing, I do now strongly feel that the second woman in the painting could actually be a man, and that Sun Frame is representative of the entire human race, wishing for a better outcome as a whole.
How about that, huh? Isn't that incredible? All of these community respondents were amazing. And Grace, thank you for spending the time and the thought and the research on this work. I just wanted to share in the next slide, Jetty, if you can forward that. I don't know what this work is to me, but when you stare at a flash or a reflection in the sun and you get these sort of auras of floating, you look away and you see blue and white blotches. I kind of thought, well, maybe this was a reference to that, these kind of floating things. Maybe, might not be, but I think everybody's interpretation is valid. And I love that Grace brought up the kind of the genie idea. And in fact, I found that a art historian had mentioned magic carpets from this time period of Helen's work. So thank you, Grace, for participating in this and adding your voice and adding your thoughts and your experiences. I just want to advance to the last slide. And just talk about how we're excited to put all these works together and kind of ask what happens when you not only innovate in art, but innovate in curating and display, and you put different objects in conversation with each other. What happens? You know, you bring different voices in to interpret, you put different works together. How can these abstract shapes and colors and forms talk about dominant power structures or shifting power structures of the time or of our own time? And how can our own time change meanings and interpretations of these works of art that are historic? So anyways, I just think there's a lot to play with in our collection and a lot more stories to tell. So I just wanted to mention that. And I want to hear from some of you guys and hear what you guys thought about this when I gave you that 75 seconds to talk. But please feel free to share your thoughts or impressions, or say, no, Catherine, that's not what I see. This is what's going on. I'd love to hear it. Yes, Fred.
I didn't take quite such a broad view, but to me, it was as if the dark colors that are within the sun, its core, could have been expanding. Somehow the sky found a way into the sun, and it seems like the sky is trying to contain the dark parts that are within the sun's core to save the sun.
Very cool. Very cool. Thank you. So you literally saw it as part of the sun.
I mean, once you have the title, it sort of, that's a good point. Should you look at a title before you look at a piece? And do you think in many of those cases for Frankenthaler, did she title it after she painted it?
Yeah, after, but sometimes quite a bit later. And she was very into mythology and history and allegory, but sometimes it didn't necessarily, sometimes they were kind of random. That's what her biographer said, that, sometimes they don't necessarily depict what's there. I think she wanted to throw us off a little, and it might've been what she was reading at the time, who knows, right? But obviously it had to have something to do with it. So Patricia, I think you had a comment too.
Yeah, it was like a minute perspective, just of one frame, just a moment in time. Like the gray clouds will pass, like be in the moment, experience it, and then look for the gift, the red.
Nice. Especially during this time, that's a great perspective. Bob, thank you.
I have a very different perspective, because when I looked at that painting, which I liked, but the yellow seemed to be a sort of an abstract map of the United States.
Yes, I see that too, Bob.
Really?
Yeah.
Look at it again. And I don't know what the thing in the middle was, maybe an anvil.
Oh, that's the Midwest.
That's the Midwest. That's
interesting.
Yeah, I agree with Bob, and that one of the I see many things in this painting which I love. I love Frankenthaler, and one of the things that I do see is it could be a map of the U.S. And I loved Grace's comments about wishing, because I think of it as wishing that COVID, we're going to become alive and in the sun and able to get out again. And at least it's starting on the edges and it's expanding and expanding. But I do see it as a very feminine piece, but a very strong piece, and lots of things in, and lots of different things. But I do like the fact that it seems to me that the sunny part is spreading, and I can interpret that as part of the pandemic. We're getting freed from that, which is still at the core. I understood, Catherine, that that Frankenthaler had a list of possible titles, and that when she finished a painting, she would go look through the list and see if there was a title that she thought was appropriate.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. And
I don't
Nila
know.
Aga, who I showed in that cube, she does the same thing. She just keeps poetic titles that she thinks of or hears, and she just keeps them on her phone and assigns them for her pieces. So interesting. Marianne, you had a question or a comment? Oops, you're muted. The microphone down at the bottom, maybe?
I got it. I think I got it.
Good.
Am I there? Okay. I guess because it's graduation time, I saw a mortarboard and I saw what Grace saw in the genie lamp, and it was kind of like the hope of this whole new generation of kids that are coming out into the world. And it just, that's where I went with it. And speaking of new kids coming out into the world, I was just at the Downtown Art Center. You have got to see this BFA class from UH's exhibit. Phenomenal. Phenomenal.
Fantastic. Yes.
These kids are amazing.
Right.
Great.
That's all.
Thank you, Marianne.
My map on.
Anybody else want to share their comments? Yes.
Hi. I guess I'm more simple-minded. I just saw looking out a window at an erupting volcano. Maybe it's from me.
I don't think that's simple. I think that's dramatic.
That's wonderful.
Not simple at all.
And the red core, yes.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Catherine, how about you? I want to hear what you think about this. You know this work better than many of us. Katherine Love.
Me, it's funny because we hadn't talked about it, but I was thinking, well, actually, I see something different every time I look at it. But I was also thinking of that moment where your eye is blinded by the great bright sun, and especially the sun falling on water. So, especially here in Hawaii, that's a real, experience, that visual experience that we all, I think, have. And that really bright sunlight on water, especially. And maybe the clouds and the mountains are also reflected within that as well. Yeah, it's wonderful to keep, come back and look at it again, and your impression might change depending on what you've just gone through that day, or what you've seen out in the environment that day. So yeah, I would encourage everyone to come and see the show in person too. We're practicing social distancing, but everyone, is wearing masks, and it's a wonderful show to see in person. So hope everybody feels safe to come to the museum.
And you can't replicate these in PowerPoints or slides either. So especially that Osorio, that's spectacular in person, and that's not a good image of it. So come on in person. Anybody else want to share their impressions? Jetty, you don't have anything to say about it? I bet you do.
No, I was thinking about the light reflecting off the water as well. I think, a lot of the other descriptions and visuals that people saw was like, wow, I'm very simple compared to these really sort of poetic and very deep readings of the work. So maybe I need to go in again and meditate in front of this. What else I can glean from it. But that was incredible. Thank you so much. We're coming up around 7 o'clock. So I just want to thank everyone for participating, and thank you, Catherine, for sharing about your life and about Helen Frankenthaler. And it was lovely to see such a great big group of people this time around. So we hope to see you again next month in June. And we will be digging a little bit deeper into Joyful Returns. So that should be another really exciting one. So I hope you folks are ready and excited for that as well. And I hope you folks have a great rest of your evening. Thank you so much for joining. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, guys, for coming. Bye.